Hello and welcome to Learn to Quilt Level 2. I'm Tori from the Quilt Patch by Tori. I've been quilting for 20 years and I am a quilting instructor and a pattern designer. So I'm really excited to dive into piecing with you today. So we're just going to focus on piecing a top, a 4-patch. It's right here. We're going to be making one of these today, or several of these, and to create a row is the goal today. I'm going to show you how to cut efficiently, how to nest your seams to make nice corners, how to square your blocks, square your rows, and then put the whole quilt together. So with this class, you got the 4-patch quilt pattern. Now you have two options. You have a baby quilt pattern and you have a baby quilt size or a throw size. So you're making the same block. You're just making more of them if you want to make a throw. And then a half patch is how you finish the rows of the baby blanket, and that's just half the 4-patch. Just the half patches, and that's in the directions as well. So we'll be going over that. And so you got your pattern. You also get your I always get tongue-tied. Top 10 tips for beginner quilters. So we will be going over a little bit of this today, but feel free to read that at your own pace. It's going to be really good for filling in any information that might be missing from this class. And then you also get a 30% off coupon for my book, What the FVP Is That? Quilting Terms of Vernacular Guide, which is just that. It's a book I made out of a necessity. Because when I started quilting, I didn't know the terms. I was really confused. So I wanted to make a sheet for my beginner quilters with all the useful terms. It turned into a book with an acronyms section and a tension guide and all the other stuff. So if you're interested in this, and pictures, that's what I really wanted. That's why I got so big, because I wanted to add pictures. But if you're interested, go ahead and check it out. It's in my shop, and you get 30% off just for taking class today. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with cutting fabric. So we're heading over to my cutting table, and from there we're going to start piecing. And we'll be using a 1/4 inch seam through the entire quilt. Now, if you're not sure, if this is your first time doing a 1/4 inch seam and you're not sure where the measurement or the line is on your needle plate or throat plate, right here right next to your needle, just use the edge of your pressure foot. And as long as you keep that seam the same throughout the entire quilt, it will most likely come out square. So here we go, over to the cutting table. So I've been using 2 fabrics today. Just as your instructions said, I have a pattern, cute little tricks, and a complementary orange solid. That's the word that almost escaped me. Solid flannel. So both of these are flannel, and I like to use flannel as an example because it's a little extra stretchy and it likes to stick. So I'll be showing you how that all goes and why that is important to know. Okay, so we're going to start with cutting our fabric. Now, if you've never cut a large piece of fabric from the bolt, quilters usually keep it folded in half as it came off the bolt. So we put our selvage ends together, so it's still folded in half. There's 2 layers here. Now, most likely, the straightest part of your fabric is going to be your selvage edges. So your selvage edges are the stiffer threads that were used during construction of the fabric. They usually have words, the different colors, or some fuzzies. It's pretty easy to find the selvage edges. So what you're going to do is match those together. You may have to create a new seam, or not seam, I'm sorry, new fold. That's okay. The first thing you need to do is make sure that you have a straight line. So we're going to line up the selvage edge on a line on my mat. And I'm going to line up on the 3 just so that you can see it. And we're just making sure this is straight. We're going to make sure this side of the fabric is nice and straight. So you can see it comes off just a little bit off my mat. So I'm going to fold it over, making sure that it's mostly straight. Now as close as you can get, because you're going to be creating your own straight line. This is straight and this is straight. Most likely the cuts will be straight. Now do keep in mind that a lot of patterns aren't printed perfectly straight. So if you do notice that the chucks themselves, if yours has chucks, are just a little bit off, that's usually a printing issue, not necessarily a straight line issue. take a close look at that. You can figure it out from lining it up like this. So we're going to line up our ruler. I'm going to use the closest 1/4 inch to the lowest edge of the fabric. So if I scoop my ruler over, I'm going to hit the lowest edge, which is right here. Now this line, I'm trying to line up on this, is 1/8 of an inch, which is kind of difficult. So I'm going to go ahead and scoot that over and go to the nearest 1/4 inch, which just happens to be the 2-inch line. I'm going to line my ruler up, edge of the ruler on the 2-inch line, and use the width of the ruler to line up all the lines down the mat on the top and the bottom. So my cut will be nice and straight. If you've never used a rotary tool before, I do suggest that while you cut, you push down and not forward. The momentum of pushing down will already carry you forward, and most likely you're less likely to shift your ruler if you're just pushing down with both hands. So again, push down, fingers spread out. Usually go towards the middle of the ruler, and then I push down. Tuck your thumb in. Don't get your thumb. Push down and cut. And if you notice you tend to move your ruler near the top or the bottom, I do suggest that you can, you start here, cut, stop, lift, push down at the top, and then keep cutting. And that'll help carry everything out and hopefully keep everything straight. Okay. So we have our cut, we have our straight line. We're going to be cutting our fabric down this way while it's still folded in half. So let me double check our pattern. We need to cut our strips, which is step 1, into 5.5 inch strips. So I'm going to move my ruler down 5.5 inches. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. So that's going to be on my 8.5 inch line. So rather than focusing on lining my edge of the ruler up on the half dots really on the mat, I'm looking at the 1/2 inch line inside my ruler and lining it up on the 8-inch line on the mat. That way I have a straight line instead of dots to try to line up. And then I line up all the lines, the width of my ruler on the top and the bottom. Again, push down, keep your thumb out of the way. Cut. We have our first strip. We're going to go ahead and just move on down the strip. I'll show you at the end what we do. So move on down. So I count like this. When I have a half, it starts at a half. I go half. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to be 5.5, which on my mat is the 13-inch line. Again, I'm lining up edge of my ruler on that 13 line. I'm using the width of the ruler. That's why it's clear. Line up the lines through the ruler and that line. So there we go. Push down, keep your thumb out of the way. Nice. Now, as you get more comfortable with cutting, you can start layering your fabric. So you're not just cutting one strip at a time. So with this piece, I believe it's wide enough. Let's check. Maybe. Not quite wide enough. But if you originally start with a bigger piece, you can actually fold this even in half. Instead of having 2 layers you're cutting at once, you could have 4 layers. But I don't suggest trying that until you get comfortable with 2 layers. Comfortable where your hands go and everything when it comes to using these rotary tools. So I'm lining up this edge. I picked a random line. I like to work with the middle of my mat a lot. So I picked 5, just line that up on. I'm going to count 5.5 inches over and then cut another strip. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. Cut that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. Lining up that half mark this time again on the 11-inch line, which is where this is ending. 1, through the width of the ruler, push down. Okay. So keep in mind that you will need more strips. I started this quilt, so I had examples for you. So these are the strips. Now I have this extra. You can either keep this as a scrap or you can toss it. It's up to you. So next we're going to do the orange. Grab your orange fabric. Again, we're going to start by creating a straight line if it doesn't already have one. So I line up my selvage edges, which this one you can tell there's no writing, there's no fuzzies, but it can tell in person that the edges look a little different. That's going to be your selvage edges. So that's what I'm going to line up here. And here's a good example where we can fold it in half. So right now it's still folded like it comes off the bolt. We always, as quilters, typically cut fabric as it comes off the bolt. Fold it in half, so we have 2 layers. This time I'm going to put my selvage edges together, so I have 4 layers. Make sure it's flat, there's no big wrinkles in there. Then pick a line, which happens to be 3. Pick a line down here. Line it fairly straight. It looks like the edge is a little bit off. I'm going to go ahead and recut my straight edge on this side. So it's straight down here. Go ahead and fold that so you can see it. So fold this down. Now if you line up the folds over here, most likely it's going to be straight this way. Okay, so I'm going to line it back on, this time it's going to be the 2, just picking a line. And then down here, I'm going to line it up on 4. So straight line, scoop the fabric over to its lowest ease. One more. Good. I'm going to line up my ruler on the 2. Looking to make sure it's straight all the way through the width of the ruler. It's not. Now if you're cutting through 4 layers and we folded the top, there's 8 layers up there. So just be prepared to push a little bit harder when you go through so many layers. So here we go, we're going to trim our straight edge. Make sure you're pushing down, not forward. Okay, again we need 5.5-inch strips. So we're going to go ahead and count 5.5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. It's going to be 7 this time. Right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. Yes. Lining up my lines, I'll do the ruler. Making sure it's straight on the top and the bottom. Again, be prepared to push down a little bit harder because we do have more layers. And there we have our first 2 strips. 1, 2. Ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and cut one more. With this fabric, I wanted to save some for binding. So I'm going to unfold it and just do one more singular strip, 5.5 inches. 2 line, straight line down here, straight line right here. All right, we count 5.5. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. Just easy. Lining up on both sides, top and bottom, through the width of the ruler. And okay, so if you're not done cutting, if you'd like to finish cutting all of your fabric, feel free to pause the video here and we will keep going. So this is going to be my binding, so I'm going to save this for later. So we have all our strips cut. We have 3 orange and 3 print. Now for the full pattern, remember I do have some ready. To demonstrate, we do need 5 total of each, 5 total strips of each for the baby quilt, and 7 strips of each fabric for the throw size. So from here, this is where the fun part starts. We're going to practice our 1/4 inch, and we're going to sew our 2 fabrics together. So we take a strip of each and unfold it all the way. Now with a solid fabric, you might not have a right or wrong side. The flannel is almost like that. You can kind of tell there's the right side, but if I mix it up, it's not going to be a big deal. But here's the wrong side of the print and the right side of the print. So pretty, ugly, pretty, wrong, right. We're going to go ahead and put our right sides together, or pretty sides together. And I just line up one edge of the selvage. And I do know with experience that these are Joann's flannels. They tend to be different sizes. So if you'll notice, this edge is lined up. Near the bottom, we have one that's slightly longer than the other. And that's okay, because how we're going to trim them is we're going to cut our way towards this uneven edge. So don't worry about that. Line up one edge, and we'll work from there. So we line up one edge, right sides together, and you're going to sew down the raw edges 1/4 inch all the way down one side. Then you're going to do the same with all of our other strips. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and pause and sew our strips together. Now, in regards to pinning, I almost forgot to mention this. I don't tend to use pins. I do just wash my fabric, and I adjust it every few inches, making sure my sides are the same as I work down. But if you'd like to pin, be sure to pin so that the pin heads are pointing out, so that they're easy to remove while you're sewing. They won't poke you. And if you also don't like pins, clips can be a fun or an easy way to replace pins, or they will hold your fabric for you just like a pin. You just remove those as you go. You don't want to try sew over a pin or a clip. You'll risk breaking your needle or bending a part in your machine, or bending your needles. Your pins. So make sure you move those as you go. You're just doing one side. So now we have our rows sewed together, or our strips sewed together. So our next step is to press. Now keep in mind, we are not ironing, we are pressing. So we're going up, down, and I'll show you that in just a second. Now there is a lot of opinion on pressing seams. It really depends. I really come to find that it is a personal preference, and it depends on the colors you're using and the design you're making. For this particular instance, I'm going to go with to the dark side. So that means you go towards the darkest fabric. Now between a dark blue, or royal blue really, and an orange, they're very similar in lightness and darkness and value. So I'm just going to go ahead and press it to the busiest side. So that way, from the front, you have less chance of having like a little shadow. If this was white, I would definitely be pressing it towards the darker side. But yeah, you can also press your seams open. So you can choose a side, or you can press them open. Now for this instance, like I said, I'm going to be choosing the dark side, which to me is like the busier side, which is going to be the trucks. So I just spray with a little bit of water. And you can also use starch, or a mixture of, half and half starch and water, which will help make your starch last longer, because starch can be a little bit pricey. Yeah, but here's pressed open. A demonstration. And remember, you're not pushing when you press, sorry. You're going to go up, down, up, down. Now, as you get more experienced, you're going to, your up, down is not going to be so dramatic. You can, if your seam is being stubborn, you can nudge it a little bit on the seam, and because that's where there's some structure. But if you're pressing your fabric out here, you don't want to push down and out, because that's going to stretch your fabric, because there's nowhere to stabilize it up there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and press my rows to the dark side. Now you can choose what you'd like to do. I'm going to suggest dark side for your first, if this is your very first quilt, just to see how you like it. And then after that, you can choose open for a side. One more quick note about pressing is your goal here is to make sure you're not getting any fabric trapped inside the seam. So when you press, sometimes it'll still be folded over just a tad, and you can lose fabric in there. So you want to make sure that while you're pressing, you're getting that seam fully open. So you have to be careful about tugging, but you can use your fingers and kind of encourage it to spread a little bit to make sure. There's a little bit got caught in there. And if you'd like to be extra sure you get it out, you can kind of nudge it just a little bit with the iron. But like I said, you don't want to push down and push out. A little nudge will probably be safe. It's being stubborn. For pressing the back, I like to press the back first, and then the front to make sure I've got all those untucked. For the most part, usually comes out well. But I just want to make that note, like make sure that you're not getting any fabric tucked into your seams because you'll be losing fabric on the outside if you do. Okay, our strips are pressed. Our next step is going to be to cut our blocks. So from this point, we're going to start making half patches, which is those 2 squares. So I'm going to start with just one, and then I'll show you how to layer those. I'm going to grab one. I want to start with the side that I lined up. So this is already lined up well. I'm going to use my straight side here, a straight side there. I'm going to go ahead and first trim off the selvage. So we don't want that selvage in the quilt, just because they are made out of thicker threads and they act differently when they're washed. So they'll age differently. So we go ahead and chop those off. We'll have the same fabric through the quilt. So I'm lining up again all those numbers through the width of the ruler. Sure, especially if it's on top and the bottom all lined up. I'm lining up on, just chose 2 is my line. I like to see the big numbers. Make sure I'm doing this correctly. Lining them up correctly. So here we go. Chop off the selvage. And then we need 5.5-inch strips. Again, for making squares. I'm going to go ahead and scoot that down to the 1. My ruler over 5.5 inches. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. Line it up on 7.5, so between 6 and 7. So 6.5. Again, I'm looking at the 1/2-inch mark here to line up this. I'm not looking at the edge of the ruler because I'd rather line up on a straight line than dots. Makes it a lot easier. With ruler, top and bottom. Okay, my fabric shifted, so let me just fix that a second. Great way to move your fabric gently is kind of scratch it. There we go. And then cut. Make sure to push down, not pull. And there's our half patch. So we're just going to cut the length all the way down to the end. And we're going to chop off that extra bit at the end. So I'll show you. Half, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On the 12. Sure it's straight on the top and bottom. And now again, when you get more comfortable with cutting, you can start to layer, and this will go by a lot faster. But until you can cut straight without everything shifting, I would practice one at a time. Again, lining it up here on the 1 at the top and the bottom, making sure they're straight. Moving over 5.5 inches. Checking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. Chop these up all the way. When we do sew, the machine does push the fabric, so you will get a little bit of wiggle. You will get shift in there. It's just the way the machine sews. And if you're working with flannel like I am, you get a little extra stretch because flannel is a little extra stretchy. 2, 3, 4, 5.5. Almost down to the edge. Scoot that up. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. So at the end, you'll notice that we don't have enough for another piece, so we're just going to trim that off. And now you can either keep this as a scrap, or you can toss it. Now my rule is always it has to be 2.5 inches square at least. So this might actually hang out for a little bit. So here we have our half patches. So you're just going to cut every strip you have just like that. Now if you have multiple strips, which you will, you can go ahead and line those up and cut them at the same time, if you feel comfortable. Twisted. So what I do is I line up those selvage edges that were already lined up. So these two are straight. So I line them up. But I also check out not just the edge, but the seam. Make sure the seam is meeting the same spot. And then I'll line those up. All the way down. I'll shift as I need. And then I'll cut off the selvage and then trim these down 5.5 inches all the way down the length of the strips until I cut off the ends, just like we just did. So after you get those cut, this is where we're going to make our 4 patches. So my fabric is directional, and I did that on purpose because I really like having a directional fabric for a baby blanket. That way, it doesn't matter which is the top. So if these are faced up and these are faced down, this can be the top, or it can turn and this can be the top. Oh, so funny thing, I noticed while I was sewing these together, I cut my orange strip 6 inches instead of a 5.5. But I thought this would make a great demonstration on how to square a block, because you can really see what needs to be cut off. So no stress over this. If you made this mistake, it's totally fine. I'm going to show you exactly how to fix it without any fuss. So to put our 4 patches together, you take 2 of your half patches, you turn one upside down, and you're going to nest your seams down the center. You're not going to worry about the edges of your blocks. You're going to focus on the middle where your seams are. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. I'm going to talk about nesting seams. So if you did go ahead and press your fabric to the dark side, then they will be pressed opposite directions, which will be really easy and handy for this. So we're going to nest our seams. So again, we're going to match those seams in the middle. So you take your seams, now pressed in opposite directions. So see, we have the blue going in opposite directions, orange in opposite directions. So what you're going to do is have those blues meet in the middle. And it makes what I call a shelf. So right here, it looks like yellow because it's part of a truck. So yellow and blue are meeting, and orange to orange are meeting. And it's just nesting that seam in nicely where they're both pressed on either side. And it's going to make a nice, scoot just a little bit more. It's going to make a nice corner. Now from here, you can pin, keep it in place. You can also use a clip. I'll start here. And there. Go to the edge of your block and sew from the lowest edge all the way down to the lowest edge. And you'll have a 4 patch. So I'm going to go ahead and sew. I'll be right back. So here we have our 4 patch sewed together. You can tell that I have my awkward blocks a little bit too large. That's okay. Here's the corner. I'm going to go ahead and press that out so you can really see that. Here's the back with the nested seam. Already. Oh. So there we go. So then we're going to press that. Now from here, again, you can, because we have opposite sides, so dark side might not be the best choice for putting our 4 patches together when we press it. So opening might be our best bet for this step in our top. You can tell I like to finger press. I do like to finger press a little bit, get it ready. I grab my iron, my water. But make sure you're not soaking your fabric. Just a light little spritz is great. Again, just kind of nudging with the top of my iron and pressing down. Nudging a little and pressing down. Avoid pushing out. Up, down, up, down. Okay. Okay. There is our block pressed. Here is our center seam. Here is the front. A wonderfully nested corner. Just about perfect. Awesome. Now, if you see that and you notice that it's like a 1/16 of an inch off, When it's back here, can you tell? I can't. Keep that in mind. Nobody's going to walk up and look really closely at your corners. If it's this close, nobody's going to notice that it's just a 1/16 of an inch off. Keep that in mind. It looks great. I'm really happy with it. So yay, from here, after you make your 4 patches. So you have a choice here. I do get asked this question a lot. You can go step by step like we've been doing, where you can cut all your strips and then sew all your strips together and then cut all your strips and then make all your 4 patches. Or if you're like me and like to move around a little bit more, you can do a strip at a time. So it's your choice, it's your preference. It is technically more efficient to do each step and then put everything together. But I like to move around a lot. I don't like to just sit and sew. I like to sit and sew a little bit, stand up, go press a little bit, come back over here, cut a little bit. So that's my preference. It's up to you how you would like to do this process. And I would suggest making all the 4 patches before you make your rows and then moving on from there. So here we are with our funky little block, because I cut a little bit too big of an orange strip, and that's okay. I'm going to show you how to square your block. So I've never been taught how to square a block. If you know anything about me, you know I'm mostly self-taught. This is the way I taught myself how to square blocks, and it's come out wonderfully. And I don't know if anybody does it differently. This is how I do it. I use my seams. I am comfortable in my straight 1/4 inch seams, so I'm going to use my seams as my direction to line up everything. So I'm right here, I've just picked this random line in the middle. This is 13, so I'm going to line up 13 on the seam. And then I'm going to line up this one, which happens to be 5, on the top seam. So up and down seam, vertical versus horizontal seam. And then I'm going to scoot the ruler out or towards the edge of the block until it hits the lowest point. A wiggle, 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 wiggle. I do have 2-year-olds, so I tend to have little fun things thrown in there. Okay. And then I'm going to trim. So I have a straight edge. So again, not again, but I didn't clarify, squaring a block isn't necessarily making it square, it's just straightening up the sides. So you can square a triangle block, and it's just straightening up the sides. So you can tell, this is what I trimmed off. It's very little, not much. With cotton, sometimes you don't even need to trim. So as long as you have a straight edge, you're good. With flannel, the reason why I like to use flannel is it does get stretched while I'm sewing, so I get to show you how much trim you might get off. Trim off. So really that's what you're trimming off, is what the machine kind of stretched. So here I'm lining up horizontal or vertical lines. This happens to be 15. This one is 5 again. I'm going to scoot it out to the lowest point, which is going to be on our blue. Making sure it's still straight. Got off a little bit. Just go to the top a little too fast. There we go. Okay. I'm going to trim off that extra. So now we have 2 straight sides. Now check this side. I'm lining up. It's like 13 horizontally, vertically on my seams. Scoot the ruler out, and that is really straight, so I'm not going to mess it up. Turn it again. Got to cut off this 1/2 inch over here. I'm line up the 12 this time on the horizontal seam. And the 1/8 of an inch happens to be that one. So I'm going to scoot it just, no, most edges right here. So there we go. Straight to me. Happy with that. There we go. It's just a tiny bit that was trimmed off. You see the blue right there. And of course the 1/2 inch that I cut to it. But there we are. There's your trimmed block. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and pause. I'm going to make a few blocks and then show you how they go together in the row and then show you how to square the row. So here is a little bit about chain piecing. As you're piecing your 4 patches together, you can go ahead and chain piece. So what that looks like is you sew the first piece, which is right here. The second piece, you're going to stop about 1/4 inch away from the edge, keeping your needle down. You're going to line up the next piece. Just a little bit, it's just a tad little long. I'm going to fold up the next piece right next to it. I'm going to go ahead and keep sewing and let that pressure foot pick it up and let it keep sewing all the way down. And then you just keep adding the next one and the next one and the next one, and that's going to help your piecing be a little bit more efficient. So now we have enough 4 patches for a row for the baby blanket. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and a half patch. So the way we sew our row together is exactly the same way we did our one second. Okay. My example was a little off. But it's the same way that we put our rows together. So we're going to go ahead and sew our half patches together and nest our seams the same way we did our blocks. So you're just going to line up those seams and nest right in the center. Okay. Now for this, we're going to go ahead and sew the 4 together and then add that little half patch on the end if it's a baby quilt. So have that half patch. If it's a throw, it'll be a full other 4 patch. So here's our row sewed together. I did have to combine a few blocks that I made previously with the few blocks I made now. Adding the half patch in there first helped offset the style correctly. So you may have to play just a tiny bit to make sure your directional fabric, if you have one, is going the right directions. But it does work out if everything is cut the same way. So here we go. We have our row sewed together. So we just sewed our 4 patches together with a 1 patch in there, or half patch. And we're going to learn how to square a row. So I do get asked why does quilting have so much squaring and cutting in it? And the reason it does, especially if you're working with something stretchy like flannel, is because as we sew, it pushes the fabric, and I did mention that earlier, but here is a great example of what we'd want to cut off. So let me go ahead and zoom in. So here you can see that I sewed this piece together most likely in this direction, and it just pushes the fabric up on one side just enough to where it's off a little. Now an experienced quilter will notice that and can probably go ahead and sew this together without worrying about it. But as a brand new quilter, if you're relying on your straight sides, it's going to be much handier to go ahead and trim that little bit off so that you're not following that line. So everything will line up better and you'll sew straighter. So here, that's what we're going to do. I tend to, again, use my seams with my ruler. I pick numbers in there and I line up those lines on my seams as straight as I can get them. So I'm happy with them. Again, using the horizontal and the vertical lines. And then I can see, you can see where the fabric was pushed up. It's pushed here, it's pushed right here. Then go ahead and zoom back out a little bit so you can see that. And it's just a little bit, but after adding 7 rows together, that 1/8 of an inch is going to grow 7 times. So your row could potentially get off an inch, inch and a half, and it's not going to look well. It's going to get rumpled. Your beautiful corners that you have inside your blocks will not meet outside your blocks, and it gets really frustrating. So if you're comfortable leaving this as is and you're experienced enough to sew those straight lines together, that's perfectly fine. But if you're not, and this is your very first quilt, I do suggest trimming these little bits off. That way everything is nice and straight and you can follow up on that. It's not much trimming. in way of cutting off fabric. It does take a little bit of time, but it is worth it. So we're going to go ahead and push down and cut down that side. See, it's just enough. We got that straighter side. So we can be confident in our straight 1/4 inch. And here's a little bit more coming off. So I just line up inside on the seams, shift it a little bit, and then scoot the ruler out again to the lowest point, all the way down. And it looks like it's just this little bit of orange. It looks like I think this is the half patch in here. Yeah. So this direction, and it pushed the fabric up. So we're just going to sew off that little bit that got pushed up. Actually, just a little bit more. There we go. There we go. So cutting off this little bit, I am much more confident in my straight seam. I line up my straight seams and make it nice and square. I do both sides. So you can see here's that half patch. I ended up having to put it in the middle just because I needed to offset my directional fabric. And you can tell it's that half patch because there's my 1/2 inch that I cut the orange strip too much. It's the only one I didn't get trimmed. So I'm going to go ahead and trim that. You can choose one side and work your way over. You can also fold when you get more comfortable with folding your fabric wonderfully and lining up the seams inside of it. You can fold this in half and actually trim the row a little bit more efficiently. So here I'm lining up my seams here, 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 encouraging those to lay down the way they are repressed. So some of them are open, some of them are to the right. I shouldn't say the right, to the dark fabric. Then you can see that if we line up the seams, where those need to be. Where those need to be trimmed, I should say. So you can see here, I believe you can. Go ahead and zoom again. Here is where I need a little extra cutoff. Now, I'm a big believer in having a wonky quilt rather than sacrificing the design. There was one time I made a pumpkin quilt and I was told that the most important thing for a quilt is to be square. So I tried to square that pumpkin quilt 4 times, and each time I did a practice, it cut off half a pumpkin. So I cut off half a pumpkin thinking that's what was important. I don't know what I was thinking, honestly. And it compromised the design. The whole quilt ended up being wonky. So if you notice your rows are just a little bit off to the point where it might compromise your design, don't worry about squaring the row so much as keeping the integrity of your design. And I think you'll understand what I mean when you get to that point. But here it looks like I can cut just a little bit off there. So here we go. So that's what I did decide to cut off. Put that on the white so you can see a little bit better. And there's the second half of my row. So it can get more efficient. I'm going to get a little bit more practice and a little more confident. Again, after you do a row or two, why don't you go ahead and fold in half and try one. This is our practice quilt. Zoom that out. So our rows are ready after this point to go together. So I have 2 rows here, and I just wanted to walk you through how to piece these rows together. It is the same process as nesting seams. We're going to go ahead and focus on lining up our seams rather than the edges of the fabric. So here we have our rows. We're going to put them right sides together, being sure to offset the designs. We're going to line up down the length of the row and nest our seams. Again, all the way down, from seam to seam. Keep in mind that it is flannel. As you sew, it may stretch. You can encourage it a little bit, but I would not push it. They should line up very nicely, especially if you've been nesting seams this whole time. They should line up very nicely, and it looks like you just about do. Awesome. And you're just going to sew the rows together just like that. Right sides together, Nest those seams all the way down, and before you know it, you have a quilt. As I put this quilt together, I do suggest doing, instead of putting row 1 to row 2, row 1 and 2 to row 3, row 1, 2, and 3 to row 4, that you work towards the middle of the quilt. So you work row 1 to row 2 and row 5 to row 4, and then row 4 and 5 to 3, or you can do 1, 2, and 3 together, and then sew 1, 2, 3, 2, 4, and 5. And the reason is the weight, because if you're sewing 4 rows that are already sewed together to 1, you're going to have a lot more weight with the 4 rows than the 1. So if you work your way down that quilt, you're going to have a lot more weight on one side. It's going to be harder to keep everything straight and together, and it's going to be hard to manipulate as you sew and keep everything together. Even with pinning, it's going to be hard. But if you have the weight a little more evenly distributed, you'll have the same weight on both sides. It's going to be a lot easier to keep your 1/4 inch straight as you sew, because that weight's going to be more even on either side. Even though on this particular quilt we have an odd number of rows, it's still going to be easier than having 4 rows sewn to 1 row. And then if you keep that in mind for bigger quilts, we have 12 and 20 rows. It'll really add up. So work your way towards that middle. And last bit of advice. When sewing these long rows together. So this one for a baby quilt's not too long, but once you get into the even throw size, that if you're making a throw, these seams are going to get really long. And we already talked about how as you sew, the fabric's going to get pushed. So on a longer seam like this, when we're talking about sewing rows together and borders on, you're going to be seeing a lot more push at the end of a long seam. So if you start in the middle and work to the end, there's a lot less push in one direction. So you're more likely to have things lining up better if you start in the middle of a long seam and work to the end, and then go back to the middle and work and sew to the other end. Just make sure in the middle you overlap that stitch and back stitch. That way it's locked, it's good to go, and knotted, and won't go anywhere. There you go. Thank you so much for joining me today. Your next step is going to be learning how to quilt. I do Quilting 101, or you can move on to our skill building block of the month program inside our Patches subscription. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and check it out. It's on our website under the Patches subscription. And I'm Tori McElwain. I hope you have a great rest of your day.